In 2026, the four biggest tech companies on Earth are going to spend about $725 billion building artificial intelligence. Not on salaries, not on acquisitions, on infrastructure, chips, data centers, and the power to run them. And that number is up roughly 77% from the year before. To give you a sense of scale, that's more than the entire annual economic output of countries like Switzerland or Poland. It's being spent by four companies in 1 year, on one bet. And here's the part that nobody tells you. Most of these companies can no longer pay for this out of their own pocket. For years, big tech was a money-printing machine. They threw off so much cash they didn't know what to do with it. Buybacks, dividends, cash piles bigger than most national treasuries. That era is quietly ending. The spending has gotten so large that even the richest companies in history are now reaching for the same things you and I reach for when we want something we can't afford. Debt, clever financing, and a few structures that, if you squint, look uncomfortably familiar. So today, we're answering 3 questions. 1. How are they actually paying for this? 2. Is it even sustainable? And 3. If it isn't sustainable, what happens to the entire microchip industry that's been built on top of it? Let's follow the money. There are basically 3 ways the hyperscalers are funding this. They stack on top of each other, and each one is a little riskier than the last. Bucket 1. Their own cash. This is the boring, healthy one. In 2024, the 4 biggest tech companies generated around $450 billion in operating cash flow between them. That is an absurd amount of money. It's the reason this whole thing isn't a scam. These are genuinely some of the most profitable businesses ever created. But look at the maths. They're spending $700 billion plus and generating 400 odd. The spending is now bigger than the cash coming in. For the first time, Amazon's free cash flow, the money left over after the bills, is expected to go negative this year. So cash alone doesn't cover it anymore, which brings us to the next bucket. Bucket 2. Borrowing. The hyperscalers have started tapping the bond market, borrowing from investors the same way a government does. In 2025 alone, they issued more than $120 billion in new debt. And the projections for the next few years run into the trillions. Now, these companies have spotless credit, so for a while the market lapped it up. But there's a tell. The amount of AI-linked borrowing has gotten so big, it now makes up around 5% of all investment-grade corporate bond issuance, roughly 3 times the tech industry's average over the previous decade. When that much new debt floods in, lenders start asking for a little more to compensate. And quietly, the cost of insuring some of this debt against default has been creeping up. Bucket 3. Keeping the debt off the books. Here's the trick. If a company borrows $100 billion directly, that debt sits on its balance sheet. Its credit rating takes a hit, and investors get spooked. So instead, the hyperscalers have started building separate companies called special purpose vehicles to hold the data center and borrow the money for them. Let me make this concrete. Late last year, Meta needed to build a colossal data center called Hyperion. Instead of paying for it directly, it set up a separate vehicle and raised around $27 billion, with private credit giants like Blue Owl, PIMCO, and BlackRock putting up the bulk of the cash. Roughly 80% of the cost was funded by outside investors, pension funds, insurance companies, people hunting for steady yield. The genius of it is that Meta gets its data center, but the debt mostly doesn't show up as Meta's debt. It turns a giant upfront capital cost into a multi-year rent check. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Oracle are all building versions of the same machine. And if the phrase huge off-balance sheet vehicles that hide the real debt is ringing a faint bell, yeah, that's the structure that took down Enron. Even the Bank for International Settlements, basically the central bank for central banks, put out a warning this year about how these arrangements are quietly wiring the tech giants and the private credit world together. So that's how they pay. Their own cash, plus a mountain of debt, plus a layer of financial engineering that pushes the risk onto bondholders and pension funds. It works. The question is whether it keeps working. To know if something's sustainable, you have to ask a simple question. Is the money coming back out the other end? And here's where it gets uncomfortable. There are two cracks in the story. Crack 1. The revenue gap. All this spending is a bet that AI will generate enormous revenue. So how much is it generating today? By generous estimates, the entire AI industry is pulling in somewhere around $50 to $60 billion a year in actual revenue, against more than $500 billion a year in spending. Read that again. The industry is spending roughly $8 to $10 for every single dollar of revenue it currently earns. OpenAI, the poster child of the whole movement, is on track to lose around $14 billion this year. That's nearly triple its losses the year before. It's betting it'll hit $100 billion in revenue by 2029. Now, that's not automatically insane. Amazon lost money for years. Railroads and telephone networks were money pits before they became the backbone of the economy. Building something huge before the revenue arrives is how capital-intensive industries get built. But it only works if the demand actually shows up. And right now, the build is running years ahead of the bill anyone's paying. Crack 2. Circular financing. This is the big one, so stay with me. Watch the loop. Nvidia makes the chips. It invests up to $100 billion into OpenAI. OpenAI uses that money to build data centers and fills them with Nvidia chips. Or it commits hundreds of billions to Oracle and CoreWeave to build the data centers for it, and they go and buy Nvidia chips. So the chip company funds the customer, who pays the cloud company, who buys chips from the chip company. The money goes in a circle. By 2026, analysts have counted more than $800 billion of these interlinked arrangements across the AI world. Why does that matter? Because when companies buy each other's products with each other's money, demand can look real when it isn't. Each lap around the circle gets booked as revenue or backlog at multiple companies, even though it's largely the same dollars going round. Michael Burry, the guy who called the 2008 housing crash, the one Christian Bale played in The Big Short, has bet against this. He compares it not to Enron, but to Cisco at the peak of the dot-com bubble. The honest answer is this. The difference between a flywheel and a house of cards comes down to one thing: whether the demand from outside the circle is real and durable. Today, nobody actually knows. But Burry's real bombshell wasn't about the circle at all. It was about something hiding in plain sight on every one of these companies' balance sheets. Here's a question that sounds boring and turns out to be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. How long does a chip last? When a company buys an expensive asset, say a building, it doesn't count the whole cost in 1 year. It spreads it out over the asset's useful life. A building might be 30 years, so you book a little bit of cost each year. That's depreciation. Now, the hyperscalers are telling investors that their AI chips last 5 to 6 years, so they spread the cost over 5 to 6 years, and each year's hit to profit is nice and small. But here's the problem. Nvidia releases a dramatically better chip roughly every year. A cutting-edge AI chip is often obsolete for frontier work in 2 to 3 years, not 5 or 6. Burry calls stretching the lifespan to flatter your profits one of the more common frauds of the modern era. His maths, by undercounting how fast these chips wear out, the industry will overstate its profits by around $176 billion between 2026 and 2028. He reckons that by 2028, Oracle's profits could be overstated by about 27% and Meta's by about 21%. Which finally brings us to your third question. If this does break, what happens to the microchip industry itself? To understand the risk, you have to see how absurdly concentrated this whole thing is. Trace the money. It starts with 5 American hyperscalers. It flows mostly to one chip designer, Nvidia. Those chips are manufactured almost entirely by one foundry, TSMC, in Taiwan. The critical memory comes from basically 3 companies: SK, Hynix, Samsung, and Micron. And nearly all of it is built using machines from essentially one company, ASML, in the Netherlands. That is a supply chain with almost no slack in it. Right now, while demand is booming, that concentration looks like strength. Everyone's sold out. Memory chips are in shortage. TSMC's boss has said supply won't catch up with demand until 2027. Nvidia's data center business alone is running north of $50 billion a quarter. So picture the transmission if the AI bet sours. Hyperscalers get nervous and cut their spending. Instantly, orders to Nvidia dry up. Nvidia cuts orders to TSMC. The memory makers, the most cyclical link of all, get crushed because memory prices swing wildest. And the most exposed of everyone? The equipment makers like ASML. They sell the picks and shovels for expansion, and in a bust, nobody's expanding. Then the doom loop kicks in. Remember, those chips are the collateral behind a wall of debt. Demand falls, so chip values fall, so the collateral falls, so the lenders take losses, so the financing that funded the whole build-out freezes up, which forces even more spending cuts. Each problem makes the next one worse. Now, and this is the twist that keeps it from being pure doom, there's one genuinely reassuring difference from the year 2000. TSMC in particular sits on a fortress balance sheet, a massive net cash position that lets it absorb a downturn that would bankrupt weaker rivals. So the most likely shape of a bust isn't a decade-long depression like the dot-com fiber collapse. It's a vicious air pocket, a sharp, painful drop where the strong survive and the weak get wiped out. And that, finally, answers the question we started with. Who actually pays for AI? The hyperscalers themselves, the ones spending the most, are actually the most protected. They've got the cash, the fortress balance sheets, and they pushed a lot of the debt off their own books on purpose. The bill instead lands on the people who financed them, the bondholders, the private credit funds, and ultimately the pension funds and insurers holding all that off-balance sheet debt. So, is $700 billion a year sustainable? It depends on two things: whether the revenue shows up before the financing runs out, and whether the chips sitting in all those data centers are still worth anything when the music stops. Right now, both of those are bets, placed by the richest companies on Earth, with money that increasingly isn't theirs. Maybe it's the smartest infrastructure build in history. Maybe it's the most expensive game of musical chairs ever played. Keep your eye on three things and you'll see it coming before the headlines do: the debt loads, the credit spreads, and the moment, if it ever comes, that someone finally writes down a mountain of chips.